Chapter 37 is one of the two chapters about the nervous system, specifically neurons, synapses, and signaling. There are two parts to the nervous system. The central nervous system, or CNS, includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, PNS, includes the nerves that make their way throughout the body. Now, the peripheral nervous system has sensory receptors, and this is how we collect information from the world. So some examples of how we collect information: the rods and cones in our eye, skin receptors, chemical receptors, thermoreceptors, and again, those are examples of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the other important piece to both nervous systems is that they include neurons. So neurons are the functional unit of the nervous system. They're a type of cell, and they are able to send and receive electrical signals over long distances and send and receive chemical signals or messages over shorter distances. There are three stages to information processing in the nervous system, which again, information processing is the main function of our nervous system, our brain, spinal cord, and all those different neurons. The three stages are sensory input, integration, and motor output. So the way that I look at this is sensory input is where there's some sort of a stimulus. Integration is how our body puts that information together, how it interprets that stimulus, and then motor output is basically our response to that information, to that stimulus that we sense. So there's different types of neurons that come into play with these three stages. So sensory neurons are where there's information from our body sensors, and that sends a message to our central nervous system. The second type of neuron are interneurons, and these connect the sensory and the motor neurons, and it's a local connection between the brain and the spinal cord. Motor neurons are where the central nervous system triggers the body to have some sort of an effect. So it could be the contracting of our muscles, triggering our glands to release hormones. And finally, when you have a bundle of neurons, it's called your nerves, and it can contain motor neurons and or sensory neurons. Here's an example of the three stages of information processing along with the three different types of neurons. So what's being shown in this picture or diagram in the upper right-hand corner, you have a snail. So this is a cone snail which senses and tries to sense actually different types of prey. So a fish is a food source for this type of snail. So the cone snail has a part called a siphon, and the siphon it doesn't breathe, but it can scent. It scents different kinds of scents from the water around it, indicating that there's a fish nearby. So that is the sensory input, being able to smell, even though we're in the water, smell that there's a fish nearby using sensory neurons. The second step is the snail needs to determine, is there actually a fish present? And if it's present, where about is it? So that's where the information is processed, and interneurons are responsible for that, and that's that integration piece of information processing. And then finally, when the snail determines that, hey, there is a fish here, and oh, maybe it's off to my right or wherever it is, it's going to initiate an attack and activate neurons to release another part, which is a type of tooth or like a harpoon that is going to be ejected and essentially kill the fish or stab it, so that way the snail can consume it. And this, again, oh, and that part is the motor output, and motor neurons are responsible for that effect, that physical harpoon being released to kill that fish or that prey. So this is a summary, again, of the 3 stages of information processing in the nervous system, and using the 3 different types of neurons, using a cone snail as an example. You should understand the basic structure of a neuron. And on the next slide, I'll get into the actual definitions, but this is showing you in illustration. First, in the cell body of a neuron, that's where the majority of the organelles are located, kind of central of that neuron. From that cell body, there's an extension called a dendrite. And those are extensions, I should say, called dendrites. And dendrites are where that neuron receives signals from other neurons. The long extension is called the axon, and this is where the signal is transmitted or leaves. And it's showing you with red arrows on here, showing you where the message is moving. So again, stimulus comes into the dendrites, the signal is sent or transmitted out from the axon. The end of the axon is called a synapse or synapse. And this location is the specific place where there's a gap between 2 neurons. And often in this location, you'll find neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are the actual chemical messengers, or the chemicals themselves, that are sent across that gap or space. When discussing the neuron, there are some parts that you need to be familiar with that I've already mentioned most of them on the last slide when I showed you the diagram. The first part of the neuron that you should know is the cell body, and this contains the nucleus and the majority of the organelles. Dendrites are the small extensions from that cell body that receive incoming messages. Axons are the long extension that transmits messages away to other cells. So try to remember axons, away with the A's. Another part to the neuron, which I don't think I mentioned on the last slide, is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is not the cell itself, but it's the fatty insulation that covers the axon. And the reason for this is when that nerve impulse or that signal is being sent away from the cell body, it needs to be protected. We don't want to lose that impulse to neighboring cells, and we need it to go very quickly. So the myelin sheath provides protection for that message being sent. The synapse is the gap between 2 neurons, and in between the 2 neurons, you might find neurotransmitters, which are the actual chemicals, so chemical messengers that are sent across that gap or that synapse. And then finally, the last type of cell, and this is a general term, any type of a cell that supports the neuron are called glia cells. And glia cells help, in at least one case, they can help to form the myelin sheath. So Schwann cells are that type of cell. They're an example of glia cells, and it goes into more detail in 37.3 about those cells and the things that protect the neuron